My name is Linda Thompson, and I am 38 years old. For most of my life, I believed I had built the kind of stability I always longed for: a warm house, a family of my own, and a routine that kept me grounded. From the outside, everything about my life looked like a picture people might admire. But as I sit here recalling those days, I realize how much of that perfection was only surface deep. Beneath it were quiet cracks, subtle shadows that I tried to ignore until I could no longer pretend they weren't there. Our home sat on a tree-lined street in Boston. It was one of those old brick houses that carried the weight of history in every wall. The tall windows caught the morning light in such a way that the rooms always looked softer than they felt. The wooden staircase creaked under each step, and sometimes I would pause in the hallway just to listen. Most people might call those little noises flaws, but for me, they were pieces of a story, reminders that this house had held many lives before mine. I thought of it as a safe place, a container for our memories, though later I would come to see it differently. My husband, Mark, was 40 at the time. He had a way of presenting himself to the world that left everyone impressed. In his suits, with his tall frame and polished smile, he could charm neighbors and colleagues alike. At parties, people gravitated toward him, listening closely to his confident voice. I used to admire that about him. But inside our home, I often noticed how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a distance there, a certain hollowness I didn't want to admit even to myself. I told myself that stress from work explained it, that financial pressures weighed on him. Still, there were moments when his presence felt like a mask I couldn't see behind. Emily, our daughter, was 6 at the time. She was the light in my life, endlessly imaginative, always filling our days with color and surprise. She would spend long mornings pressed against the window, finding animals and castles in the clouds. Her laughter was effortless, and when I looked at her, I felt a kind of love that made everything else worthwhile. She was innocence in its purest form, though sometimes her words carried an unsettling wisdom, like she could see truths I wasn't ready to face. Just a few months before, I had lost my mother. Grief hung heavy in my heart, and I hadn't yet found my footing. Her passing also left me with an inheritance, something I hadn't asked for, something that felt more like a burden than a gift. I wanted to honor her, but I also felt the tension it created. Mark grew restless in those months after her death. He spoke often about opportunity, about how life could change, about investments and possibilities. I tried to believe he only wanted the best for us, but his urgency sometimes made me uneasy. One morning, as Emily leaned against the window, she said something that froze me. She told me her grandmother still talked to her. She said her grandmother whispered that we needed to be careful. At first, I brushed it off as part of Emily's endless imagination. She had always blurred the line between dreams and reality, and I didn't want to dampen that gift. But the way she looked at me that day, her eyes so serious, so certain, left me unsettled. It was the first time I allowed the thought to creep in that perhaps the peace I clung to was only an illusion. Looking back, I see that moment as the beginning. The house that once felt safe began to hold a strange weight. Mark's smiles seemed thinner, and Emily's warnings echoed in my mind long after she had skipped off to play. I told myself not to worry, that children say things they don't fully understand. But deep down, I felt a quiet dread taking root. Something was shifting in our home, and I didn't yet know how dangerous it would become. And so, As those days unfolded, the perfect image of family life started to show its cracks. I didn't know it yet, but I was standing on the edge of a truth that would change everything. At first, I thought it was nothing more than my imagination. Grief can play tricks on the mind, and after losing my mother, I tried to give myself grace for being extra sensitive. But as the weeks passed, small moments began to pile up, moments I could no longer brush aside. Mark had always been a man of structure, predictable in his habits. Yet lately, I noticed how often he slipped away into his study with his phone in hand. His voice would drop low, almost a whisper, the kind of tone people use when they don't want to be overheard. When I passed by the door, I would hear fragments his mother's name, Helen, surfacing again and again. She had a way of inserting herself into our lives uninvited, making me feel as though I was forever auditioning for a role I could never truly win. Mark adored her, or maybe feared her, and I often felt like a stranger watching the bond between them. Still, there was something different about these calls. They weren't casual. They carried a weight that settled in my stomach long after I walked away. Meanwhile, Emily kept returning to her dreams. She would curl up beside me in bed, her little hands holding tightly to her stuffed rabbit, and with that serious look children sometimes get. She would whisper that Grandma had spoken to her again. She would tell me that her grandmother warned her we needed to be careful, that danger was close. I smiled and tried to reassure her, but inside, my heart tightened. I wanted so desperately to believe it was just a child's imagination, her way of holding on to someone she loved and lost. But the way she described those warnings, clear, direct, almost urgent, left me with a gnawing fear. I told myself I was reading too much into things. But then came the discovery I couldn't ignore. It happened late one night when I couldn't sleep. Mark had gone upstairs early, claiming exhaustion, and I found myself wandering the quiet house. The study door was cracked open, which was unusual. He always kept it locked. Something tugged at me to look inside. I wish I hadn't. The desk was neat, as always, but one drawer wasn't fully closed. Inside, a folder sat on top as though waiting for me. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and saw the words printed across the front: life insurance. I flipped through the papers, my breath catching in my throat. Just a week after my mother's funeral, Mark had taken out a policy in my name. Not a small one, either. A high-value policy with him listed as the sole beneficiary. I remember sitting there in the dark, staring at the documents, my chest heavy with disbelief. The timing was too sharp, too cruel. My mother's inheritance had barely cleared, and already Mark had prepared for a future without me. I tried to convince myself it was caution, maybe even care that he wanted to make sure Emily would be safe if something ever happened to me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't love that motivated him. It was something colder, hungrier. From that night on, I couldn't look at him the same way. Every smile felt rehearsed, every word carefully placed. I felt myself withdrawing, clutching Emily closer, searching her little face for reassurance that we were still safe. But even she seemed to sense the shift. She told me again and again that Grandma was warning us, and each time she spoke, her words cut deeper. I didn't know what to believe anymore: my child's strange warnings, my husband's secretive behavior, or the documents I had seen with my own eyes. All I knew was that the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage set for something I couldn't quite name. And in the quiet of those nights, when the phone whispered behind closed doors and Emily stirred in her sleep beside me, I felt the shadows pressing in closer. That was when unease turned into suspicion. And though I tried to bury it, to tell myself I was overreacting, I couldn't ignore the growing truth. Something dangerous was coming, and I feared it was already at our doorstep. It was Emily who forced me to stop pretending everything was normal. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she looked up at me with those wide, unblinking eyes and whispered that Daddy and Grandma were planning something bad. Her words were so calm, so certain, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell her it was just another one of her vivid dreams. But the way she held my gaze left me shaken. I lay awake long after she drifted to sleep, replaying her words in my mind. Mark's secretive phone calls, his sudden change in behavior, Helen's constant interference, all of it began to line up in ways I hadn't wanted to see. Helen had always made me feel small, as though I were unworthy of her son. She carried herself with elegance, but beneath that polish was something sharp and controlling. Whenever she visited, she found ways to undermine me in front of Emily, to remind me that she could be more of a mother in my home than I was. Now, with Emily's warnings, I wondered just how deep her influence on Mark really went. In the days that followed, Emily kept returning to her dreams. She spoke of her grandmother, the one I had lost. Not Helen, as though she were still watching over us. She said Grandma told her where to hide if bad things happened, that we needed to be ready. At first, I wanted to cling to the idea that this was simply Emily's way of keeping my mother alive in her imagination, but the details she shared were too precise, too chilling. She spoke of a hidden place in the house she shouldn't have even known about. And then there were the signs in the house itself. One night, after Mark claimed he was heading to bed early, I wandered downstairs and caught a faint chemical smell in the air. It reminded me of gasoline. My throat prickled as I breathed it in, and my skin crawled with unease. I checked the doors, only to find the back door handle stiff, as though locked from the outside. When I tried the side door, the same thing happened. I told myself it was a faulty lock, nothing more. But deep down, I felt the walls closing in. The house that once held laughter now felt like a trap. Every creak in the floorboards made me jump. Every shadow outside the window sent my heart racing. And still, Emily's warnings came. She told me Grandma said the house wasn't safe, that Daddy had a plan, that Grandma Helen was helping him. Each word carved deeper into my chest, because as much as I wanted to protect Emily from fear, I could no longer deny that her instincts might be sharper than mine. I began to look back on moments I had dismissed, the way Mark avoided my eyes when he spoke about his business trips, the way Helen always called at strange hours, her voice clipped and urgent. There were too many secrets, too many coincidences, and now there was evidence I couldn't explain: the smell of fuel, the locked doors, the life insurance policy that had appeared far too soon after my mother's death. For weeks, I had told myself I was being paranoid, that grief was clouding my judgment. But as I watched Emily sleep that night, clutching her stuffed rabbit as though it carried all her courage, I realized the truth. This wasn't just a child's imagination. This wasn't a game of pretend. Emily was trying to save us in the only way she knew how. And for the first time, I let myself feel the full weight of dread. Something terrible was coming, and I could no longer ignore it. When Mark wheeled his suitcase to the front door that Friday evening, I tried to convince myself it was just another trip. He kissed Emily on the forehead, smiled at me with that carefully polished grin, and said it was an important meeting, one that could change everything for us. I nodded, though my stomach felt tight and unsettled. The sound of the door shutting behind him should have brought relief, but instead, the house felt heavier, as if it was holding its breath. I moved through the rooms after he left, checking the windows, touching the furniture, almost like I needed to reassure myself that the house still belonged to me. Emily sat cross-legged on the living room rug, coloring with her stuffed rabbit tucked beside her. For a moment, things felt almost normal. But later that night, as I washed the dishes, a flicker of movement outside the window caught my eye. A man in a dark coat lingered near the edge of the property. He paced slowly, circling toward the backyard before fading into the shadows. My pulse quickened. I pulled the curtains closed and told myself we'd stay inside. When Emily asked to sleep in my room, I didn't hesitate. Something in her small, trembling voice made me realize she felt the same unease. She clutched her rabbit and curled beside me, finally drifting off. But sometime past midnight, I woke to a sharp, acrid smell. At first I thought it was a dream, but then my throat began to burn, and my chest grew tight. Gasoline. I jumped from bed, heart pounding. The air carried a faint chemical sting that grew stronger with each step toward the stairs. My instinct was to get Emily out immediately. I shook her awake, but before I could reach the front door, the handle refused to turn. It was locked from the outside. Panic surged. I ran to the side door, then the back, but each one was the same. Every exit sealed. Then came the sound of a mechanical hum, low and steady. I looked back just in time to see the shutters descending over the windows, metal grinding against the frames until the house was sealed shut. I banged on the glass with all my strength, but it was useless. Smoke began curling from the kitchen door, thin at first, then thicker, filling the air with a suffocating heat. Emily's eyes widened in terror as she clung to me, whispering that Grandma had told her this would happen. I wanted to tell her not to be afraid, but my own fear was too sharp. My mind raced. How do you protect a child when the very walls of your home turn against you? And then Emily, in her small, steady voice, told me we needed to go behind the pantry. She said Grandma had shown her a way out in a dream. At any other time, I might have dismissed it, but with the smoke thickening and the walls starting to crackle with heat, I had no choice but to trust her. I dragged her to the pantry, pulling aside jars and cans until she pointed to a wooden panel. My hands shook as I tugged at it, and with a groan, it swung open to reveal darkness. Emily crawled in first, holding her rabbit like a torch of courage. I followed, pulling the panel closed behind us as smoke seeped through the cracks. The tunnel was narrow, smelling of earth and dust. Cobwebs brushed my face as I crawled, my knees scraping against the hard ground. Emily moved quickly, as though guided by certainty, while I whispered prayers under my breath. Behind us, the roar of fire grew louder, a monstrous sound that chased us forward. Heat seeped into the tunnel, pressing against our backs. I urged myself to keep moving, my only thought to keep Emily alive. At last, we saw a sliver of light ahead. Emily pushed against a rusted door, and with all my strength, I shoved it open. Cool night air rushed in, filling my lungs with relief so sharp it almost hurt. We stumbled into the garden shed, then out into the yard, coughing and trembling. When I turned back, the sight nearly dropped me to my knees. Flames had already swallowed the back of the house, black smoke twisting into the night sky. The glow painted the neighborhood red, eerie and violent. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer, while neighbors gathered at the edge of their lawns, their faces pale in the firelight. I held Emily close, my arms wrapped around her shaking frame, and whispered that she had saved us. Tears blurred my vision as the truth sank in. We were alive, but only by a thread. The house that once held our lives was being devoured by fire, reduced to ash and ruin, and deep inside, I knew this wasn't an accident. This was planned. As the beams cracked and collapsed under the weight of the flames, I felt the last remnants of my old life burning away. The perfect image was gone, replaced by smoke and betrayal. All that mattered now was that Emily and I had survived, and that survival had come with a price that would demand answers. In the hours after the fire, I felt as though I was moving through a dream. Emily and I sat shivering on our neighbor's porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the only home she had ever known collapse into ash. The sirens had faded. The crowd of neighbors lingered in murmurs, and I could still taste smoke in the back of my throat. That's when the police approached. A detective knelt in front of me, his face steady but serious. He asked me to tell him what had happened, and I remember the words tumbling out, almost frantic. I told him this wasn't an accident. I told him my husband had planned it. His expression didn't change, but I could feel the weight of my own desperation. It wasn't enough to say it, I had to prove it. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone. I had taken photos of the life insurance papers I'd found in Mark's study. I showed them the dates, the signatures, the clause that named him as the sole beneficiary. I told them how he had filed it only a week after my mother's funeral. The detective studied the screen quietly, his brow furrowing. For the first time, I felt a small shift, like maybe, just maybe, someone was beginning to believe me. Then Emily, my brave little girl, tugged on my sleeve. She told the detective in her small, steady voice that she had heard Daddy talking on the phone with Grandma Helen. She told him that Daddy said if Mommy was gone, everything would be his. She repeated that he said it had to look like an accident. Her words were soft, but the certainty in her tone made even the officers pause. They asked her gently when she had heard it, and she answered without hesitation. I watched the men exchange glances, and for the first time, I saw their doubt begin to fade. The investigation moved quickly after that. Fire marshals combed through the wreckage, and their findings confirmed what I already knew in my heart. Residue of gasoline was discovered in key areas of the house. The fire hadn't spread naturally, it had been guided, placed, meant to trap us. The security system logs showed tampering. Someone had programmed the doors and windows to lock from the outside. Every piece of evidence pointed toward intent, not chance. Within a day, Mark's lies unraveled. His supposed business trip didn't exist. His co-workers confirmed no meeting had ever been planned. Police found him at a gas station off the interstate. In his trunk were bundles of cash, falsified identity papers, and a burner phone. The life I thought he lived, successful, dependable, respected, was nothing but a mask hiding debt, failure, and betrayal. When they brought him in, he shouted his innocence, but even his protests pointed fingers elsewhere. He blamed Helen. He said it had been her idea, that she had manipulated him into it. But when the police questioned her, her carefully crafted facade cracked. She tried to deny it at first, but under pressure, her words spilled out resentment, desperation, twisted devotion to her son. She admitted she only wanted what was best. even if that meant destroying me to free Mark from the burden of a wife and child. Hearing those confessions sent a chill down my spine. All the unease, the whispers, the strange silences I had brushed off, suddenly they had names, motives, and proof. It was real. They had truly wanted me gone. They had wanted Emily gone. When the arrests were made, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that the truth was finally in the open, that justice was being served. Grief that the man I had built my life with, the man I once trusted with everything, had been willing to destroy us for money. Emily sat on my lap as we watched them lead Mark away in handcuffs. She held her rabbit tight, her little chin lifted in quiet defiance. I kissed her hair, whispering that we were safe now. But inside, I knew safety was more than locked doors or flashing lights. It was something we would have to rebuild, piece by piece. The fire had taken our home, but it had also burned away every illusion. All that was left was the truth. And though the truth was painful, it was the only solid ground we had left to stand on. After the trial, after the guilty verdicts were read and the courtrooms emptied, Emily and I began the slow process of piecing our lives back together. We left behind the ashes of the old house in Boston and found a small, modest home in a quiet suburb not too far away. It wasn't grand, not the kind of place people would admire in magazines, but it had something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The front porch caught the morning sun, and at night the air was filled with the soft hum of crickets instead of the echoes of fear. For the first time, I didn't measure life by appearances. I didn't care how impressive the house looked from the outside. What mattered was that Emily could laugh without shadows hanging over her, that I could breathe without second-guessing the air around me. Our little home became a sanctuary, built not from brick and money, but from survival, healing, and the promise of a new start. In the months that followed, I found a new purpose. Losing everything had stripped me bare, but it also opened my eyes to how many women and children live in silence, trapped in homes that look perfect from the outside, but are prisons within. I started a small community project, using part of my inheritance to fund workshops and safe spaces for women and children in toxic relationships. We called it Second Light, because I wanted others to know that even after the darkest nights, there can be another chance to shine. Watching women share their stories, seeing children slowly reclaim their laughter, gave me strength I didn't know I still had. Emily, too, began to heal, with the gentle guidance of a child therapist. She learned to speak openly about her fears instead of burying them. She poured her feelings into art sketchbooks filled with bright colors and bold shapes. One afternoon, she brought me a drawing that stopped me in my tracks. She had drawn 3 figures herself: me and her grandmother, my mother, the woman who had loved us fiercely in life and who, in her own way, I believed had protected us in death. I framed that picture and hung it in the hallway of our new home. Every time I pass it, I feel both the ache of loss and the comfort of love that endures. When I reflect on everything that happened, I no longer ask why. I've learned that sometimes the people who should protect us can be the ones who try to destroy us. And sometimes the smallest voices, like a child's, carry the deepest truth. Emily saved us, not just with her courage during that night of fire, but with her unwavering trust in her instincts. She reminded me to listen to my own. I've also learned that family is not defined by blood alone. It's defined by love that protects, by the hands that reach for you when you stumble, by the voices that tell you to keep going when you want to give up. My real family now is the daughter who walks beside me, the memory of my mother's strength, and the community we are building together. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: never ignore the quiet voice inside that tells you when something feels wrong. Trust your instincts, hold tight to those who truly love you, and don't be afraid to begin again. Even in the ruins of betrayal and fear, there can be light, your second light. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories of resilience, healing, and the power of love, I'd be grateful if you subscribed, left a comment, or simply carried this lesson with you. Because even in the darkest night, we all deserve the chance to begin again.